Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is one that's joined us many times before, and we discuss the endlessly fascinating topic of improvising polyphony based upon chant. Dr. Charles Weaver is an expert in Gregorian rhythm and performance practice and teaches plucked strings and music theory on the faculty at the Juilliard School in New York, as well as courses here at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. He's teaching an advanced seminar on the topic we're discussing today, improvising polyphony in a practice referred to as cantare super librum. His course will be a practicum in organum, fauxbourdon, and contrappunto alla mente. It runs from July 27th through the 31st in the afternoons here at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. That same week, Dr. Alison Altstadt will teach a course on notation and historical performance practice based upon manuscripts from the 10th through the 14th centuries. Applications are still open to non-degree seeking students until May 1st. Learn more and apply at our website, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. Click on Summer Courses. And if this is a topic that interests you, the bridge between chant and polyphony, don't miss out on these courses, as we have a wide variety of topics we cover in our seminars during the summer, and they might not come up again for a long while. So with that, on to the interview. Charlie, a frequent flyer on our podcast. Our listeners know and love your episodes, and so thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to be back.
Most people, when they hear that almost the entirety of the Western canon of music can find its roots in Gregorian chant, perhaps roll their eyes a little bit. They might think that's a manufactured hyperbole from people with a chant agenda. So I'd like to focus on an important link in the history of choral music, and that is harmonized chant. So to begin, can we situate harmonization of chant within the context of the first musical developments of the chant repertoire? Do we have reason to believe harmonization was happening in the very origins of the chant, for example, at the Roman Schola Cantorum, or even earlier in the 7th century, or in Aachen or Metz in the foundations of the Gregorian repertory?
You always like to start me off with like a really difficult, really broad question. The origins of polyphonic singing are lost in the mists of time, and it's really impossible to know how early people were treating the Gregorian melodies in this way. One thing we can say for sure is that they are in their essence monophonic. I think that's unquestionable. And that has important ramifications for how we approach the harmonization of chant. The melodies are themselves in some sense sacrosanct, having been handed down as part of the Roman tradition through the meeting of Roman and Frankish influence during the Carolingian period. However, I think one way to approach this is to say that the earliest written records of polyphonic singing we have are indeed harmonizations of chant, and discussions of that sort of thing happen basically within the same generation or two that the chant repertoire was coming into existence. So if the chant melodies themselves start to be written down in the early 9th century, we also have 9th century theoretical sources that talk about the harmonization of chant in two parts, what we might now call parallel organum or things like that. Whether such things happened before, I will leave to people like Marcel Perez in their performances of Old Roman chant, but certainly things like that were happening already in the 9th century. And then if we take maybe a broader view of the history of chant from the 9th century to the present, many different styles of harmonization, of singing in multiple parts against a chant cantus firmus, have been practiced all over the place. And such things have at times been completely central to the pedagogy of music, to the training of choral singers, and to the kinds of sounds that people would have heard and encountered in going to church. And so I think for that reason alone, it's worth looking into. We sometimes, as chant performers, we get so enamored of recreating the original sound, which, as I said, is presumably monophonic, that we can tend to discount these practices of harmonization. But I think examining them for their own sake is really worthwhile.
Or perhaps even perceive them as almost totally auxiliary, when in fact, it seems pretty apparent from the adjacency of the repertory and those descriptions that it was a very much lived thing by the earliest singers of chant.
Right. I mean, I think we can over romanticize the idea of monophony, and, well, maybe not even over romanticize, but just romanticize it to begin with. So, for instance, one of your great heroes and mine, Dom Mokro, he was not a fan of chant harmonization, even though he says he treats it as sort of a necessary evil. And in one of his letters to Vincent d'Indy, he refers to chant accompaniment on the organ as like putting plaster over a marble statue. So that's like Mokro's view of the relative worth of the Gregorian melodies and anything you might set against them harmonically.
Right. So, in our History and Principles of Sacred Music classes at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music and the classes I teach for the seminarians, I love to liken tropes and harmonizations to a visual counterpart in the illuminated manuscript. And in the illuminated manuscript, one has a text and a melodic tradition handed on for copying. But even that basic element being handed on is calligraphed beautifully. And then, of course, the illuminated capital is kind of a flower of unique beauty on the page. And it bids us to abide with that received chant and give it a creative outlet for the time and place and the person through whom it is being copied and received. And so the creative impulse is never abandoned in the church. That's what's clear. Music history didn't stop at 1600 or 1962, but it does take a given melody and text for its fertile ground. So there's always something being handed on in the traditio. What do you think prompted the drive to harmonize in the ear of musicians who began to do so with regularity? And do you think it was perhaps linked to greater liturgical solemnity in these origins?
That's a really beautiful question. To borrow an idea from Tom Kelly in his book Capturing Music, he discusses the phenomenon of tropes and prosulation and things like that, and polyphony together as outlets of one similar creative impulse to sort of set the chant in a setting that makes it even richer and things like that. So you might think of tropes and prosas as the kind of horizontal dimension of embellishing chant, and you might think of harmonizing chant as the vertical dimension of the same process. Chant has been done in so many different ways over the centuries, and the parallel organum that's described in the 9th century is very different from the Parisian style of organum from the Magnus Liber Organi that is known, by composers like Léonin and Perotin. And that is also very different from Baroque chant harmonization in 4 parts, and that's also very different from 19th century harmonizations with affaclaida accompaniment and things like that. So there's a lot of different variety. It's hard to make a general point about the liturgical solemnity of it, with the exception maybe of the Notre Dame Polyphony, where they do seem to reserve the greater polyphonic embellishment for important liturgical days. So there are only a couple of 4-part organa settings in that book, and they happen to be for the graduals of Christmas and St. Stephen's Day. So there's a kind of tie-in to the liturgical year and things like that. But in general, it's hard to make a sweeping statement, but it does. I think it's important to note that the harmonization of chant and the polyphonic singing of chant are indeed related to the idea of troping, and I think your connection to an illuminated capital is a very beautiful one.
So let's get now into some of the earliest written record about harmonization. And could you tell us about the Scholica in Kyriadis and the Musica in Kyriadis? What's in each of these books and how were the books used?
Sure. So these are two of our earliest sources of music theory that deal directly with chant. They're two closely related treatises that we can reliably date to the ninth century. They are written in a learned Carolingian Renaissance milieu, you might say. They draw heavily on classical authors like Boethius and Chalcidius and St. Augustine. The word Enchiriadis is a rather weird Latin word that's a corruption of a Greek word that means something like handbook. So Musica Enchiriadis would mean like the handbook of music. Scholica means like excerpts or something like that. So Scholica Enchiriadis is a kind of further treatment of the subject of music. Musica in Kyriadis in particular is a pretty good read if you're interested in early theory.
Can I ask you a
Um,
question about
yeah,
that?
sure.
For a long time, it's been hard to find an English translation of that, and I haven't been following the latest scholarship on that. Is it easier now to get a translation?
Yeah, so there's a Raymond de Erickson translation that's maybe a little older now and is available in some music libraries, but it is indeed hard to find online. There's an excellent online available translation by Rob Wegman, who's a musicology professor at Princeton. I'm not sure if he's translated both, but I know he has at least Musica in Kyriadis, and it's a very nice side-by-side scholarly translation with commentary. And you can easily download that as a PDF on his website. So I would point your listeners to that as a good source of it. Musica in Kyriadis is slightly more tightly organized. It starts by describing the modes and a particular pitch system, which is actually kind of unique to these books. And they use a notation called Dasein notation, which you could get interested in, but these books predate the staff notation that we became familiar with thanks to Guido of Arezzo. And so they're in their kind of this unique notational system. But the second half of Musica in Kyriadis gives a description for how to sing in organum. And it is pretty much the earliest kind of recipe book we have for singing chant in multiple parts. And then the treatise goes into organum at the fifth and at the fourth, and how to avoid certain forbidden intervals in the process of that, which is kind of interesting. It's not being slavishly parallel, but involves sometimes doing nice other kinds of motion to avoid tritones and things like that. And then the book ends with a really beautiful description of the Orpheus myth and how Orpheus represents the singer, and if you try to grasp Eurydice, who represents divine wisdom, you will lose her because talking about music and making any sense is very difficult. As anyone who's taught music at any level knows, it's very hard to say anything approaching wisdom about it. So I always find the last chapter of Musica in Kyriadis to be, encouraging in that I'm not alone in my lack of complete understanding of things. We only see the truth of music like through the veil that Orpheus saw Eurydice through. Anyway, Scholica in Kyriadis is a little bit more loosely organized. It has some really interesting things to say about chant performance practice. It doesn't say a whole lot about organum, but it does then get into more the mathematical side of music theory.
Yeah. This Orpheus myth was something that the recently deceased father, Robert Scaris, spoke about so eloquently. And I think it's been an image lost in recent decades to inspire the musician. So it's great that you bring it up. So I'm wondering if we could discuss rhythmic independence. That's obviously the next a sort of development of polyphonic practice, that not only do we sing the principal melody and the organal melody at the same time, but the organal melody develops a flourish that is not in the principal melody, and the two gain rhythmic independence. So are those things anticipated in the Scholica Inquiriatis and the Musica Inquiriatis? You talked a little bit about the other types of motion, but what do we see in terms of rhythmic independence or not in those?
Yeah, those earliest treatises, all of the counterpoint discussed is note against note, and that remains true also in Guido's Micrologus from the 11th century, which is another important source for this kind of parallelish organum, or what we might call discant, where you have two voices moving completely homophonically. The independence of the rhythm of the organal part comes a little bit later and belongs more to the 12th century with what came to be called organum purum, or pure organum, where the chant note itself gets stretched out for anywhere from a few to several notes of the organal voice, and really changes the texture in that way. And of course, this led to a sort of crisis in notation, because especially when the chant part starts moving more regularly, as happens in the melismas of a gradual that is being sung in this way, then you have to figure out how many notes of the organal part go against the principal part, and you have to figure out a way to notate that so that it can be preserved and remembered for the future.
Yeah. And of course, this is a not so much a side issue, but bigger than we can discuss in this particular episode. But it's when you start getting a profusion of notes in the organal voice or the decorative voices compared to the chant melody that the church starts feeling an itch to intervene, because, of course, it really destroys the sense of continuity in the delivery of the text that you can perceive even in the melismatic chant. And I think, in my mind, that's obviously the precursor to a Renaissance tradition in which you're simply composing melodies on the text, but that are no longer based on the chant. So I don't know if you have any thoughts just about, if you were a churchman at that time, would you have been nervous about these trends?
Yeah, I think one thing that we often lose sight of when we look at the music of the Notre Dame organum school is that they're really only looking at the graduals and the alleluias. Those are the only chants that get that kind of treatment. The classic example is the Perotin setting of Viderunt omnes, the gradual for Christmas Day. Yeah, the first word, viderunt, takes something like 3 or 4 minutes to sing. And so it's certainly a different kind of text setting, and you're absolutely right that it destroys anything like the pace intended by the original authors. On the other hand, thinking of the late great Dr. Mart's discussion of the shape of the liturgy and the way that the different parts of the Mass proper can be received by the congregation in different ways, the gradual and the Alleluia are a perfectly suitable time for slow, meditative intake of a text over the course of several minutes. So that would be my sort of response to any scrupulous churchman, I would say.
I'd like to take a moment to invite listeners in Southern California to an upcoming event this March 7th, 2026, the Feast of St. Thomas Aquinas in the older Roman calendar. The Catholic Institute of Sacred Music is co-sponsoring with Thomas Aquinas College and the Thomistic Arts Guild a fantastic and unique event all day at St. Vitus Church in Northridge, entitled Music for Worship and Leisure, Musical Beauty in the Life of the Christian in the Light of St. Thomas Aquinas. This one-day conference features philosophical talks on the nature of beauty and its role in the life of the Christian, as well as practical sessions in learning how to listen intelligently to music for leisure, as well as some of the basics of singing Gregorian chant. Focused on building camaraderie and a greater understanding of the role of music in one's own life and culture, the day culminates with a solemn mass in the traditional rite and a festive dinner. More information and the link to sign up are on our events page, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. Click on events. And you'll also see on there an upcoming online retreat, Monday, March 2nd, led by Archbishop Cordileone. 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, just 1 hour in a time of reflection and prayer for musicians and those who love sacred music with the Archbishop during this Lenten season. We hope you can join us. Now, back to the show. So let's talk a little bit about what you referred to recently as the crisis of notation. What do you have to have in notation to be able to have the necessary information for rhythmic coordination?
You have to know how many notes of one voice fit into the notes of another voice, right? So there are examples of 12th century polyphony, especially from the school of Saint Martial in Limoges, in what is now southern France. And in those pieces, you'll have both voices moving in a way that seems completely uncoordinated, where one voice will have 2 notes and the other voice will have 5, and you have to figure out how to fit these together. And this often requires a lot of rehearsal and coordination, and who knows if what decision we reach has anything to do with how it originally sounded. But in organum of the Notre Dame school, you start to get these sections, especially when the original chant melody was highly melismatic, where you have to fit in some kind of regular pattern between the 2 voices. And the original way that the people who wrote this down did it was with what are called the rhythmic modes, where they use a certain set of ligature patterns, like a 2-note ligature followed by a 2-note ligature followed by a 2-note ligature followed by a 3-note ligature, or vice versa, where you'll start to see these patterns using older neum forms, but now with a new meaning. And that's what we call the rhythmic modes. That's used sometimes in the music of the Leonin type and frequently in the music of the Periton generation. Of course, that has its own problems because it doesn't allow you to sing syllabically, because you're requiring multiple notes being tied together in neumes or ligatures, as we later came to call them. And so then you have to develop a notation system that allows you to sing long and short on a single syllable note. And that is basically where our modern notation came from. You know, a stem means that this note is twice as long as a note without a stem, something like that.
But the ligature system, even in that Manus Liber Organi, is sometimes notoriously difficult to transcribe because there are ambiguities there that then, even though you know the rhythmic modes, you're looking at the ligatures, there are multiple ways you can interpret it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, and then the, especially in the early generations, like what we now call the music of Leonin, and of course we don't really even know whether Leonin had anything to do with the pieces that we ascribe to him now. You know, in previous iterations of musicology, people have tried to apply the rhythmic modes much earlier to that sort of stuff. You know, the classic example of this is the Leonin Ek Dies, which is the gradual for Easter Day. There is a rhythmicized version of it fit into one of the rhythmic modes that was published by Willy Appel several decades ago, and I think there are 1 million YouTube recordings of that, just as like an organ piece or something like this. And you know, if you look at the original notation, you really have to do I don't know what you might call like ligature gerrymandering to figure out.
That's a great phrase.
To find the rhythmic implications. But who knows? I mean, it's the old notation is always perilous to make definitive statements about this.
It's such a great intellectual adventure. I remember studying for my comprehensive exams, and I chose, some music by Leonin and Periton, and I realized that I had been given really no tools in my music theory experience up through my doctorate to really understand that. And I just had to really think a lot about the origins of notation and what are the possible interpretations here. Because, I'm sure everyone in their music history book has at some point, the six rhythmic modes of the Notre Dame School of Polyphony, but then like nobody ever actually tries to do transcription in their classes.
Right. Right. And then to sort of bring it back to the topic of like improvised harmonization, even one step further would be to look at the treatises on organum and then improvise accordingly, so that you really have a basis to approach the repertoire that is in the Magnus Liber Organi from the perspective of someone who practices the craft itself.
Yeah. That's a great point. And we're going to come back to improvisation, which is one of our focuses for this episode. But let me go just a little bit further yet about the sorts of harmonies being improvised here. Of course, there's a sort of like florid dissonance available in the Leonin Periton repertoire. But when do we start seeing the introduction of the sweet intervals, the thirds and the sixths, the imperfect consonances, as we refer to them, in improvisation and composition?
Sure. They come kind of gradually into existence over the centuries following Leonin and Periton, such that if you were to just take the broadest view of the history of polyphony from the early 1200s until the Renaissance, the thirds and sixths are initially treated more like dissonances, and then they start to be treated more like consonances, right? And that happens gradually over time and at different rates in different places. There never stops being a preference for octaves and fifths as stable harmonies for beginnings and endings. And that remains true in the 15th century. But in the beginning of the 15th century, you start to see music that is saturated with triads, for lack of a better word. And they didn't have terminology like that at the time to describe them. But, classically, we think of English music of the generation of John Dunstable, who then was extremely influential on Banchois and Dufay and other 15th century composers. So that's basically the beginning of the 15th century. We start to get this kind of pan-triadic style. And in improvisational music, that's around the same time that fauxbourdon comes into existence. So whereas before you might have two-part discantus that would end on a stable octave or fifth, but might use some variety of intervals in between, by the 15th century, you have three-part harmonizations that are essentially use parallel 6/3 sonorities as a way to harmonize chant. And that seems to have become wildly popular in the 15th century and never really disappeared thereafter.
So let's talk a little bit about how you might see this entitled fauxbourdon versus fauxbourdon. I mean, is it really the same thing and it's just practiced in England versus France? Or can you identify different things that they like to do to improvise in those harmonies in the different areas?
That's another tricky question. So the words are essentially the same, just in different languages. So English fauxbourdon refers to the same kind of three-part parallel triad, parallel first inversion triad, to put it in modern terms, practice of harmonization. And we get some English sources describing how to do this a little bit later on. One of the earliest sources we have for fauxbourdon discusses an English practice, which the author distinguishes from a French practice. Whether that was really universally true or not is really hard to know. So I'm not sure that I can make a really clear distinction between the two. The term fauxbourdon ended up sticking around much longer and later came to mean various kinds of harmonization schemes, often in four parts, often not strictly parallel. So you might find a 19th century book of fauxbourdon harmonizations of chant And they're not just going to be this same three-part style. So in a way, the term fauxbourdon becomes more of an umbrella for improvised polyphonic singing of chant. But in the early century, the 15th century, they both seem to refer to the same basic practice.
So let's talk about how this was actually taught to singers. Because, of course, you are going to be here at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music this summer teaching it to singers in our class on Cantate Super Librum that you have before you a chant book, and there is an improvisatory polyphonic or harmonized tradition on top of it. And could you speak a little bit about various ways in which that was taught?
Sure. So it's, of course, one of those things that has been widespread and used in different ways in different times. So one path you might take is to start in two parts, what you might call a sort of proto-fauxbourdon. And this involves having one singer sing the chant melody and having the other singer sing parallel thirds except at the cadence, where you sort of reunite with the chant melody on a unison. If you do this with voices of different types, if you have a man's voice on the chant and either a boy's or a female voice on the counterpoint, you end up in parallel sixths, and that is itself kind of the kernel of the fauxbourdon style. You can learn to do three-part fauxbourdon shortly after that. What I find really interesting, though, is the kind of later Renaissance practice of four-part harmonization. And the way that works is, the tenor or the soprano will have the chant melody. And then if the tenor has the chant melody, the soprano will sing parallel sixths, except at the cadence. And then the bass and the alto have to follow other rules, like starting a third below the chant and singing a fifth below the second note of the chant, and then singing a third below the third note of the chant and a fifth below the fourth note of the chant, and so on and so forth. And the results are actually quite remarkably beautiful. And it's almost the first time you encounter this practice, you almost feel like it's magic that you took a chant melody and turned it into four-part harmony. And then, of course, in the more advanced levels, and I'm not sure that we would be able to go much into this in a week-long course, but we have evidence that, the improvisation level got much further in the Renaissance. For instance, there are discussions of what the chanting was like in the Roman basilicas in the 16th century by Adriano Banchieri, who's a kind of theorist of continuo playing and modal theory and things like that in the turn of the 17th century. And he says in the Roman basilicas, they did what he calls contrappunto alla mente, where they'll just be singing from a chant book and everyone knows how to kind of improvise discantus parts against it and create this beautiful, lush sonority. Another famous example is the job description for the Toledo Cathedral choirmaster, circa 1600. If you wanted this job, you had to be able to open a chant book and sing a melody against it, and then also with your two hands dictate two other parts that go against it using the Guidonian hand, so that your comrades could follow that and make a beautiful four-part harmony. I don't know how much of that we'll be doing in the CISM course, but we might try a little bit. And then, this stuck around. You occasionally come across it later. I'm teaching a course on Monteverdi right now at Juilliard, and there's a letter from shortly after Monteverdi died to Giacomo Carissimi, the great Roman composer of the 17th century. And the letter is trying to attract Carissimi to Venice to take over the music at San Marco. And the letter says, well, you don't even actually have to be there that much, because on most days they just improvise the polyphony. This is remarkable to me that this is still happening in the 1640s. It was extremely widespread and was probably very sophisticated. So I'm not sure if I have a great formula for how one would learn to do it, except to suggest that in the 16th and 17th centuries, it seems like this was pretty much the entire basis of musical pedagogy, and that you would start from a very young age learning to improvise melodies against a chant background. And that might be something worth investigating now.
So, of course, an interesting topic to any musician is the border between improvisation and composition, or the relationship between those two things. So, if you look at the history of late medieval or Renaissance choral music, who are composers that stand out to you as composing in a way that's clearly informed by this contrapunto alla mente or cantare super librum practice? You look at their music and you can hear something akin to the improvisatory tradition, but in their composition.
Oh, that's a great question. I think one really good example of this is Josquin. In a lot of his four-part choral writing, you see this texture of things that could have been improvised using these formulas. And he'll sort of go in and out of them seamlessly. It often happens at moments when he's trying to express something either mystical or like the use of homophony for a particular rhetorical purpose. Like, for instance, at the et incarnatus of a mass. That's typically when he'll go into this texture to show, this kind of solemnity or something like that. Another great example by Josquin is the motet Tu solus, qui facis mirabilia. That very much could have just been, it sounds very much like the four-part fauxbourdon sound world. And I think if you don't learn how to do it, you don't know as well how to recognize that when you encounter it in music. And that's just one example. I think there are probably many others.
Thank you so much, Charlie. This is always it's always fascinating to talk to you about this. And if students are interested, they can apply to take your course. Of course, our deadline for the Master of Sacred Music degree program and the post-baccalaureate certificates has passed, but students can still take just one or a couple classes during the summer without matriculating into the degree program. And so that particular last week when you are teaching here, July 27th through the 31st, your class on Cantare Super Librum is paired with a manuscripts class taught by Dr. Alison Altstadt on notation and practice in the 10th through the 14th centuries. Of course, that manuscript tradition there bridging the divide between monophonic practice and polyphonic practice. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're always happy to have you back.
Thanks for having me again. It's always fun.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time. And until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.